Three self-radicalized Singaporean men detained under the Internal Security Act were honing their combat skills to fight for militants in the Middle East. The trio, aged between 21 and 44, were influenced online by the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict. Analysts warn the threat of social media spreading religious misinformation and radical content will only increase with time. Sabrina Ng tells us more.
Authorities say the latest cases are not related, but there are common themes. They were self-radicalized online and influenced by the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict. Also, they were preparing themselves to join militant groups in the Middle East and fight against Israel. One visited a firing range in Bangkok to familiarize himself with firearms. Another would practice with toy guns. One of them practiced slashing motions with kitchen knives and simulated knife attacks, and another, with a martial arts background, was practicing punches and kicks at home. The first detainee is 21-year-old Muhammad Indra Akmal Effendi. He was emotionally affected by the Israel-Hamas conflict after watching online content. He also came across extremist materials on armed jihad and martyrdom, and developed a strong desire to fight for Hamas. One expert says the ongoing conflict in the Middle East could be pushing some people to take extreme actions.
Such geopolitical realities, wars, conflicts, has become a tool in triggering people to react very much emotionally with misinformation. And this inability for them to, in a way, act humanely towards such a cause or such a conflict.
Another man, Muhammad Latif Rahim, was based in Bangkok. He was arrested in October 2024 upon his return to Singapore. The 41-year-old had been viewing online content on Islamic prophecies about the end of times to deepen his religious knowledge. The Israel-Hamas conflict further convinced Latif that the end was near, and it accelerated his desire to engage in armed violence. Latif admitted he was willing to carry out any instruction from Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, including to attack Singapore.
In social media, you see the editing part play a role here, or maybe specific content that create anger play important role here. Unlike if you sit down in offline religious setting, there will be constant dialogue, exchange of knowledge, and then that is play important role. So the key here will be anyone who want to study religion, it is better for them to learn through proper channel.
The last man, Narisham Yusuf, was similarly interested in Islamic prophecies on the end of times. He was exposed to the teachings of foreign radical and segregationist preachers on social media. He also viewed online extremist materials on the Israel-Hamas conflict and was convinced he has a religious duty to fight in Gaza. The 44-year-old believed the military training he received at the Singapore Armed Forces during his service would be useful. All three individuals acted alone. There was also no indication that they had radicalized or recruited others in Singapore. Their families were unaware of their plans. ISD says it has dealt with at least 5 Singaporeans whose radicalization was either triggered or accelerated by the Israel-Hamas conflict. It says these latest cases highlight how overseas conflict can have an impact on Singapore's security.
The Defence Ministry says processes are in place to detect personnel who may pose a security threat. If identified, it says such persons will not be placed into positions where they can develop soldering skills or gain access to equipment that could pose a threat. MINDEF was addressing claims by ISA detainee Narisham Yusuf, who said his military training with the Singapore Armed Forces would come in useful when he joined militants in the Middle East. MINDEF says it is a legitimate concern and security threat that national servicemen could use the skills they have learned to commit criminal acts or acts of terrorism. But adds that the Military Security Department regularly screens for persons who may pose such threats and works closely with other government security agencies. While there are 3 new ISA detainees, the Internal Security Department says 4 other Singaporeans have shown good progress in their rehabilitation. One of them is 40-year-old Muhammad Khairul Ridwan Muhammad Sarif. He was released from detention and put on a restriction order last November. He had been detained since 2022. Khairul previously planned to join Hamas in Gaza. Authorities say he has been assessed as no longer posing a security threat that needs preventive detention. Another successful case is 46-year-old Abdul Bashir Abdul Qadir. First detained in February 2007, he was released 3 years later, but detained again in 2012 after he revisited his plans to engage in armed violence overseas. Abdul Bashir was released 4 years later, and his restriction order was lifted last October. The third individual, Muhammad Hussein Sainuddin, is a 51-year-old former member of the terrorist group Jamaah Islamiyah. He was detained in February 2007 and released on a restriction order 6 years later. His restriction order was lifted last November. The last individual is Murad Muhammad Said. The 52-year-old was a freelance religious teacher who spread beliefs that promoted violence and segregationist views. Murad's restriction order was lifted last December.
So the effectiveness is a work in progress for all of us because of the evolution of the threat itself that we're seeing today. So it's a continuous work in progress, but with greater support, with greater information and participation from all the different segments of our nation itself, that surely will help in terms of making Singapore a more peaceful, a more harmonious community.